Okay, welcome everyone to the 12th edition of Dreaming in Symbols. Dreaming in Symbols is a podcast dedicated to the exploration of spirituality and religion from a non-dogmatic literalistic standpoint and also from a non-militant reductionist point of view. While most platforms of dialogue are dedicated to one of those two camps that seem to be at war with each other, Dreaming in Symbols represents a third alternative to the approach of spirituality and religion by looking at this subject from the areas of psychology, uh, comparative religion, mysticism, mythology, and allegorical interpretation. Shows are weekly. The primary time is usually always 4:30 Pacific Standard Time, typically on Saturdays. But today is a special edition that's broadcasting live on Sunday. We welcome callers to come on in. If you'd like to join the chat live, feel free to message me either on Facebook, that's Aussie CDA Facebook page. You can message me on Twitter. And also, let's see, how else can you get a hold of me? YouTube, of course. And so, yeah, if you'd like to join into the call, please let me know. Today's topic is looking at religion or understanding faith from the perspective of history and archaeology. So what happens when your faith is challenged by history and archaeology? And with me today, currently in the chat room, is Wayman29, who's been a guest on the show before. I just got a message from one of our other panelists. He is running late. Apparently he's stuck on the subway. So he's en route, but he'll probably be late to the show. But that is Path of Abraham, who will be joining us hopefully in due course. We also have a third guest whose name is Frank, and I have not talked to this individual, and I have not heard from the individual yet whether this person will join us or not. So we'll start off the show with just Wayman and myself. So Wayman, I'd like to take the time at this point to thank you again for coming on to the show and being a part of it.
Sure, glad to be here. It's always a pleasure to come on and talk, and it's one of my favorite things to do, talk and learn from other people too. And it's great having all these different perspectives.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and it will be really great to have you on the show. I mean, considering your personal journey from a more evangelical fundamentalist background to where you stand now as a agnostic, and I think you and I can certainly begin the conversation by talking about the subject of being challenged historically, and what does it mean to study the historical record and the archaeological implications when comparing that to long-held beliefs. And I know that you have spent a long time reading books by Robert Eisenman, Bart Ehrman, but particularly Robert Eisenman, and I know you just finished one of his books. So maybe we could start off with, if you wouldn't mind, just kind of giving us your impressions of the literally the doorstop size book of Robert Eisenman, if you wouldn't mind.
So the Eisenman book that I just finished was sent to me by a YouTube viewer who was part of the Eisenman book club, and there were a few people on Facebook who formed the book club, and he was kind enough to send me a copy. And early on, I had Eisenman on my shelf with his first book, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And I picked that up because it was early Christianity, New Testament related. I didn't really know who he was. I started reading him. He writes very thorough, and he repeats himself a lot, but well documented. So it's almost like textbook format. It's you need a whole cup of water to get through the whole book, because it can be very dry. And on the other hand, if you persevere and get through it, he has tons of information in there, and he branches out, and that's one reason why his book is so thick. Like, even in the New Testament code, the one that was sent to me, is 1,000 pages, but he mentioned that there was 100 or so more pages added onto that in the notes, which I got later in a binder. So everything that you need to know was in the text itself. So that made it a little bit longer too. So when he would quote something, he would actually put it in there, like references, when he would have biblical references or Dead Sea Scroll references or early church fathers references. All that would be printed out what he was doing. So then the notes would be where the sources were, so you could go get it and read it for yourself to get a fuller context. But it was just very thorough. And the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians was an earlier text that he wrote. So you have a page of text and maybe 2 pages of notes. But his whole idea, he also had another book out, James the Brother of Jesus, which talks about James the Just in the early church. And he relates that to Rome and also the Dead Sea Scrolls community. With his book, The New Testament Code, he really gets into the ideas of the Dead Sea Scroll community from his point of view and his hypothesis on who that was. He views James the Just as the teacher of righteousness, and the speaker of lies, and the evil priest, the Apostle Paul. And he uses quite a few the War Scroll, some famous Dead Sea Scroll documents, very apocalyptic, and a lot of the pictures out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are just beautiful. These books sat on my shelf, the earlier books from Eisenman, for years. I didn't get to them. Now I feel bad that I didn't get to them. However, what I was reading out of, and this goes along with what we're kind of saying, reading out of BAR, the mainstream rejected him. Eisenman was and still is very bitter about how the whole Dead Sea Scroll translation team started doing those, putting together those texts and not releasing them, taking years and years. And he was very instrumental in getting that done. However, it happened. There was some shady dealings going on, and he was able to get them published in a roundabout way. The whole thing blew up. There was a copyright infringement suit against Biblical Archaeology magazine and the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Eisenman was a little bit in the background of that, but they couldn't prove anything. So when I found Eisenman on Facebook, I said, "Thanks for releasing these." You know, it was amazing that a normal guy like me can get in and actually read those scrolls now, and it's amazing. He's very bitter about the first translations that were released. He is no friend. He skipped over the late Giza Vermes' name in reference to him. I had a chuckle at that, because these kinds of disputes just go bone deep, and it's pretty amazing to see how all this transpires. I liked Giza Vermes. Giza Vermes' Dead Sea Scrolls in English was the first book out of Penguin Classics that I was able to get a hold of and read. Later, the new translation from Michael Wise and others came out, which was more exhaustive on what they found. So here you had different schools of thought, like we're talking about, on archaeology. You had the mainstream ideas. You had one part from the Israeli Antiquities Authority. You had the American idea of it from Herschel Shanks and the BAR. Hopefully I said his name right. Um, and those scholars connected to that. And then you had the fringe, which Eisenman was pushed to, and he he has a huge problem with the way that they were doing the interpretation of the literature and dating it. He thought more of it should have been in New Testament, early Christianities around the time of Paul and responding to the Roman invasion. Some, he says, may have come earlier, but the War Scroll, Damascus document, and the there was another one, Community Rule, should have been part of the first century early Christianities as they were separating from Judaism, and there was different sects of Judaism starting to branch out into the Christian ideas. So Eisenman talks in his book about the Apostle Paul, and I never put the Apostle Paul together in such a way as I did after reading this book, because when you go through, after reading Eisenman's book, New Testament Code, and you read things like Acts, the writings of Paul, it can make better sense from his point of view, at least to me anyways, on who Paul was writing to and why, and how he was undercutting the early church of James the Just and Peter and the early apostles, and why some of those apostles had conflicts with them. So a lot of scholars, especially New Testament scholars, will say, Paul was fighting the Roman Empire and he undermined the Roman Empire. According to Eisenman, that was not the case at all. Paul was working for the Roman Empire, and he was trying to get more people into the Jewish fold. Judaism seen it as mixing clean with unclean, which is something that if you're trying to remain pure, you cannot do. There was huge retaliation to what the Romans were doing, appointing Roman sympathizers as high priests, infiltrating the temple and temple sacrifices. Gifts were coming in from emperors and being accepted, which was very sacrilegious and made temple worship impure, because now temple was influenced, it's kind of like today money in politics, by gifts that were being sent in. So later on, they would build a wall so Herod and the rulers couldn't see the sacrifices being done on the Temple Mount. That's found in Josephus. But so all these infiltrations, they've seen it as making the belief system impure and forced assimilation. So the Dead Sea Scrolls community decide if they can't be pure in temple, they'll go make their own community and be pure. And why is that? Because they were very apocalyptic. They believed that in order to have angels fight among you against the Romans, you needed to be absolutely pure for divine intervention. And in the War Scroll, it's beautiful because you see how all that is laid out. It's like a Jewish revelation, like it's a revelation out of Judaism on how all that would happen and occur, right down to what they'd be wearing and when the trumpets will blow and all the kind of stuff that commands that would be given when, and it's amazing. And they believe that they would come in and angels among them would fight against the impurity of the Roman Empire and purge the land, because not only did they see temple as being impure, but also the land. The land's holy. So had the Romans infiltrated the land and the temple, it's almost taken everything away from them. So they tried to get it back And obviously, we know the end of that, where the Romans leveled Qumran, and they went to fight Jerusalem against the Romans, Qumran communities, and it all ended at Masada with the mass suicide. So it's pretty amazing. Paul's ideas won out. So now Pauline theology is very prevalent. But you read things like Acts 15, where James is forcing Paul to come in. Here Paul is all things to all people, and he talks about that. To the Jew, he's going to be a Jew. To the Gentile, the Greek, and so on. People from James would follow him around and try to correct all these things. And Paul was very irritated by that, but they forced him to come in. They forced him to do the Nazirite vow. The hardliners there, who did not want to mix pure, clean with unclean, seen it as impurity. Paul was bringing Gentiles to temple, which was strictly forbidden. And here he's taken a Jewish Nazirite vow, which is very holy to do. They forced him to do it, and he did. And they beat him to every inch of his life. And it's amazing how people, when they read that, don't know why Paul got beat up everywhere he went. It was because of this. It was because he was slack in Jewish law when he was around Gentiles, but pretended that he was following the law when he was around Jews, so that he might win Jews and Gentiles, like he says. However, it made him seem very hypocritical and impure. And if angels were going to fight among them, and if divine intervention was going to happen, that sort of thing had to be cast out. And they tried to. And they even took vows not to eat or drink. You can read about it in Acts, until they killed Paul. And he had to claim Roman citizenship just to save his hide. And it was amazing. So that's kind of Eisenman's view of it. And, how archaeology and history from those schools are still competing with each other. And, you can pick up a Biblical Archaeology magazine and read it, and then pick up a book from Eisenman and see what he says, and some of these other people that get sidelined by modern scholarship, like the family tomb of Jesus and fringe things like that are pushed to the fringe. But there's some very good, important ideas in there, and they're saying, what if? And to me, and I'm talking a lot here, but to me, I think religion sometimes, you're given the answers, and then you go out. So you're kind of working backwards a little bit. You're given the answer, and you're going out to kind of confirm everything that you had the answer to. So it's, in a way, to me, it would be confirmation bias sometimes, and that's sad, because a lot of times it's the real scientific scholarship is sometimes pushed to the sidelines because we're working with blinders.
Yeah, well, I think that's, and I thank you for that summary of Eisenman. Yeah, no, I definitely think that the last thing you just said is a great point as far as confirmation bias and the fact that, look, when you look at the New Testament, at least the Orthodox New Testament, you see that the vast majority of the books were written by Paul. And then you have Acts of the Apostles, which has, these elements to it that are pretty clear, in my opinion, but then there are these episodes like the one you just described, or the few you described. You mentioned Acts a few times, where these sort of like, there appears to be this problem with Paul, and yet if you just read Acts for what it says, it's very hard to tell exactly what is happening. You need that deeper historical and archaeological context. And I'm always wondering, for individuals, certain Christians in particular, who want to ignore history and at time, and I don't think the doctrine of sola scriptura necessarily prevents someone from engaging in historical and archaeological pursuits. I almost have an image, if I were to suggest that James White, if he were to ever hear this podcast, would call me out on this on his show, saying that sola scriptura blinds people from looking beyond the Bible. But I have this feeling, even on an unconscious level, that might be the case, because to me, I'm confused as to why more sola scriptura minded Protestants are not willing to engage in the extra biblical historical information that we have. I mean, if I just read the book of Acts for what the book of Acts says, and I have done this a few times, there are these episodes that you alluded to that just don't make any sense unless you understood the historical context. And you're not going to really get that from the book of Acts. The book of Acts does not clearly articulate to a layman reading it. If you just picked it up, it would not clearly tell you what is the significance of the Nazarite rite. What is the significance or the vow? What is the significance of the attitude that Paul has and some of the arguments that he's having with people? Why are people angry at him? Why does James call him in to come to Jerusalem and take part in this? Why is this happening? And again, it makes me wonder if the first century audience read or heard these episodes, would they be scratching their heads going, not all is well with the early followers of Jesus? There seems to be some division happening. And I've read James, the brother of Jesus, and it seems like Eisenman is really picking up on these threads that are there in the text, but unless you look at outside New Testament sources, you're really not going to fully appreciate some of these moments. And yet, as I say that, I'm wondering why so many people push Eisenman as a scholar to the fringe. If all he's doing is just following the breadcrumbs, why? And maybe you can answer this in terms of, is it really just because of a confirmation bias? They're unwilling to give him his day in court, and so they feel comfortable pushing him to the fringe? Or do they have perhaps their own apologetic spin to try to refute his theories? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think a lot of times these schools, not necessarily seminaries, but like Harvard Divinity School and places like that, all have their sets of ideas that they themselves want to project as being from that type of school. When you go to classes there, if you have a blog and you want to be in the program there, they will strongly encourage you not to blog, because what you're putting out is subpar, unfiltered, or maybe unresearched, lower scholarly kind of ideas, and they want to send you in a certain direction to where you will be able to feel at home among your peers, and so that you can pay your bills and eat and make a living off it. Because if you're like Eisenman, you get sidelined, and this is the thing that burns him up to no end, that he doesn't get credit for all the hard work he's done to the amount that the mainstream does. So I think that a lot of times it's sectioned off by the different types of schools, and they try to stay within that same vein. I've even caught Bar Ehrman doing this quite a bit, even though he's out of evangelicalism and whatnot. He still has some fundamentalist tendencies and evangelical tendencies to gravitate towards those types of things. It comes out in his writings subtly. It's not 100%. Like in his book, Did Jesus Exist? Where he's beating up on the mythics. That all comes from, what he had at Moody Bible Institute and places like that, I believe, because, they take a hard line to that. So he gets out in a more secular school of thinking, but he still hangs on to those. And I believe he still has a lot of friends that he talks to and hangs out with and associates with that are still in the evangelical scholarship kind of movements. So maybe he's hanging on to it out of sympathy, or maybe there could be a ton of different reasons on why you'd want to do that. Tradition. I find myself doing it. I myself sidelined Eisenman until I just picked up that book, and it took me 6 months to get through it, and it was amazing. And I changed my mind because it showed me how important the Dead Sea Scrolls were in a way that I never even seen them as being important before. And I'm going to have to go back and read them all. The ones that I didn't read while I was reading Eisman. That's what took so long. I had to review. And even people like Karen Armstrong and scholars like that, they run in a vein that you can almost expect when you pick up a book. You can almost expect where they're going to go. And I wonder about that too. I think it's very unfair. Like, it should be more open and stuff, but for some reason it's not. And maybe it's the environment that they're cultured in, doing that to them and sending them off in a certain way. I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting to think, who does the sidelining, who really has the, the sort of academic power to decide who's going to be sidelined and who isn't. But you bring up a good point about Bart Ehrman, because, I did read his book, Did Jesus Exist? And I thought it was a pretty fair treatment overall. But yes, I certainly think his sort of dismissal of the more mythological perspective was really interesting, because again, when I see certain individuals who attempt to be dismissive of the more psychological perspective, the more psychospiritual or mythological, I find them that they don't really, it appears to me, don't really understand that position very well. They're really out of their element. And if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, because I actually don't have the book with me, or I don't actually own this book by him, but it seemed that he was really focused on attacking Fraser in the Golden Bow. And I don't know if that's my recollection, was that it was very concentrated. I don't even know if he mentioned, for example, Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung. If he did, it was probably very surface level. But I'm wondering if you can recall exactly what the nature of his attack was on the mythological school.
Well, he was just simply saying that Fraser was making a lot of assumptions about what it was, rather than going and gathering actual evidence and interpreting it correctly. So Fraser would have tons and tons of research. However, Ehrman believed that the way he was interpreting it was not as correct as it could have been. Like, it was taken out of context to fit this idea that Fraser was trying to get across, rather than Fraser was doing the same thing that we're saying some religious apologists do, except from the secular side, trying to show all these comparisons and match it up with alternative, not alternative, but other examples of the same things that happened in Christianity. So, Ehrman's saying, okay, he was making a lot of assumptions while he was gathering this information and writing it down. And, I'm thinking that if he was more thorough, it wouldn't have came out the way that he thought it was. And, he gave a few examples of what that was. And, uh, but this book is, The Golden Vows is quite old. And the newer one that came out, the condensed version, because Fraser was very, very thorough. Like, he would give tons of examples of one thing. And I think Ehrman was saying that some of those examples weren't as accurate as they could have been. So that was one of the things, that he was blaming on the mythics, that their attacks sometimes go overboard on some of the assumptions that they make about the comparisons on where the motifs of the Christian history and story came from.
I see. Well, I certainly think it would have been interesting. Of course, I don't think if Ehrman had done this, it would have been like a total rebuttal to Fraser. But it seems like for him to fully refute Fraser, he probably would have needed to, give equal amount of evidence, because I do recall Fraser just kind of going on and on and on and piling it on. And so, but I guess, it's just interesting to see his dismissal of it and how he really was just kind of going for this very secular, sort of historical perspective of just saying, like, look, this is what we can say happened because look at the historical record, look at, and he was really kind of limiting the playing field just to that area of information. But I guess one thing that I wanted to ask you is, in your conversations with current practicing Christians of a more mainline persuasion, have you met any Christian who has been exposed to Eisenman and has just been like, and you could notice that they were having a crisis of faith, or they were perhaps sitting there going, wow, I've never considered this before? Have you actually experienced that in any of your conversations?
No, I haven't met any Christians that would sit down and read 6 months worth of material to get through Eisenman. And that's like a shame. It's really tough because he has a lot of great things to say, but he doesn't gear it towards, he tries to, as hard as possible, to gear it towards a common person so that they will be able to grasp everything that he's trying to say. It's not anything super profound once you put it together. However, it's just so much information and it encompasses. So mainstream evangelicalism, they appreciate the Dead Sea Scrolls because a lot of times their Bible interpretations, Bibles coming out, newer versions of translations will use Dead Sea Scroll literature to, you see it in the notes and things like that. So they are familiar with that sort of thing. However, like, to have them sit down and actually read it isn't, I don't think, even Eisenman's fans, even in the book club, I said, how many people here actually got through the whole thing? Very few. And it's amazing. It's, oh, we skimmed it, whatever. But I had to make a commitment to sit down. I had to set aside so many months. And I said, man, this is going to be a tough book, but I need to go through this one page at a time, one chapter at a time, and I just need to do this. I don't believe that there are a lot of people who will spend that amount of time to do it. And even his fans, I don't believe there are a large part reading them all the way through, as sad as that might be, just for me asking questions. So I've never ran into an evangelical who became disillusioned by the writings of Eisenman that would set them off in a different direction. I haven't. Bar Ehrman, yes, but Eisenman, no.
So it sounds like this is sort of a discussion that I've had with others with regards to, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, even the mystical interpretations of various religions. And it sounds like it takes a lot of patience and a lot of investment. And it sounds like that's sort of the same thing with Eisenman's work, is that you really need to have this sort of patience and this willingness to engage with, frankly, if I dropped the hardcover edition of the New Testament Code on someone, I'd kill them, right? I mean, so it's kind of like these huge books that require a lot of patience and like I say, commitment. And I'm wondering, not to sound like an elitist prick, but is part of the reason why our perspective, I use our perspective to say that what this podcast is all about, this very, psycho-spiritual, symbolic perspective, is part of the reason why there's sort of like this reluctance to engage with this position, or to even a willingness to look at the evidence produced by some of these individuals. Is it mainly because of the size of the text, and that it would be easier just to crack open the New Testament and read that at face value?
Well, I think you would know this by the way that you blow through tons of books. I seen what you read on Goodreads, and I have no idea how you do it. You're just much better a reader probably than I am, or whatnot. But I was telling my wife about this when I finished the book, and I said, "Wow, now I can go on to easier reading material," because the stuff in the scholarly textbook kind of stuff is far different than, say, a Bart Ehrman book, because he gears it towards the general public. The words on the pages are bigger, the chapters are shorter, he gives you more breaks between paragraphs, all that stuff. And those types of books, I'm sure you've ran into that before, where you had to stop and look up things. Now it's just smooth reading all the way through, gives you the information, it's easy to digest, and you just say, oh yeah. But it wasn't like hard hitting where you had to go digging and look up 10 or 15 footnotes to refresh on maybe something that you read 10 years ago on it. Also, too, I think that people maybe just don't have time to put it together. When ministers have to give sermons, as they would to third or fifth graders, there's no way that you can get in the kind of scholarship in a Bible study on this caliber. A lot of them, even when confronted with Josephus, only read the important parts of Josephus pertaining to them, which might only be 5 pages out of the histories and the wars. And it's a shame, really. I guess, like, and then to see, even to go further than that. Okay, how is Josephus manipulating his audience, and how is he gearing the Jewish wars towards Rome, making it better for Rome to digest it, setting Titus up as his king, making him look awesome. However, on the backside of that, there's a smirk, because he's getting cuts in at the Romans when he's talking about Jewish heroes and things. Yeah, the guy was a traitor, but he told it, and it's the only document really that we have. Well, one of the most important documents that we have of how that might have went down. So to get all that, it's more, oh, Josephus mentions Christ like 2 or 3 times, and these are the sections that we know. And when I talk to evangelicals at fairs and stuff, because they set up these little booths where I'm at, and we get in discussions about biblical theology and history and all that, they can talk about Dead Sea Scrolls, and they know about it, but none of them have actually been through it to actually know the historical context behind what they're talking about. They've just been taught, I guess, to be able to defend their faith by pointing to this or that, and not actually, like you're saying, sit down and just read it straight.
Well, I think it's interesting, that you've engaged with these evangelicals that are set up these booths, and yeah, I mean, I it's hard for me to wrap my head around. I guess to some extent the lack of interest in sort of going beyond one's comfort zone. I mean, certainly I can relate to it in terms of, you kind of feel like you're set in your ways, and then it can be a scary thing to then consider other perspectives, especially one that isn't just black and white. Like I pick up the English translation of the Bible and read it for what it says, and don't really engage with really in-depth hermeneutics. But again, I'm really, it's almost like I wish James White was on the show with us right now, which I don't know if that will ever happen. But I'd be really curious to ask someone like James White, because you and I can both agree James White is a highly intelligent individual. He's well educated, and yet I've often wondered, what would James White think of Robert Eisenman, and how would he respond to Robert Eisenman? I mean, would he just say, oh well, I don't agree with what Eisenman's conclusions are, so the New Testament seems to, because James White, he loves to say that the New Testament and all the documents within the New Testament all go together. There's really no contradiction. So he's really sensitive to what we might say the more liberal scholarship, is how he would phrase it. Liberal scholarship that actually will take apart the New Testament and not consider its compilation to be whoever compiled the 27 books, that they had this idea that they would all go together, and that's why they were all included. In other words, that they all support each other without question. And yet, when you see these moments in Acts of the Apostles, and when you see the content of Paul's letters, and you start to ask yourself the question, like, who was the audience? Who was he writing to? What was happening? You have to look outside of the New Testament in order to really understand that, like I said earlier. And so, again, I'm at a loss as to why someone like Eisenman is considered so damn fringy. And I would be willing to say that part of it isn't just people. I mean, it might just be an excuse. To me, it's an excuse to say, oh, his books are so big, I can't really get through that. Part of me thinks that might be a very convenient excuse, but some of it might just be people's resistance to considering a very plausible historical hypothesis. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Whenever I talk about anything, out of early Christianity, it's always so-and-so's hypothesis, because we don't know, and all we're doing is we're collecting information on what that might be and trying to put it together to form ideas about how it might have happened. But just because you're able to give an idea for how something could or may have happened, a lot of times people will attach themselves too strongly to those ideas. One great example, I was reading Backyard Professor. He used to be a Mormon apologist on YouTube, and he's brilliant. And I'd really like to get him up on here sometime, because he's agnostic now. But he was out of Mormonism, and his hero was Hugh Nimbley, and that's kind of how he's the Backyard Professor, in his blog that I was reading, said Hugh Nimbley thought, because he would come up with these alternative explanations about how Scripture could be straight up historical and true, and rebuff a lot of the criticism that was coming in with really intelligent, because Hugh Nimbley was really well read and well versed in a lot of different topics, and he could go on for days and give answers back. But he clung to those because he believed himself to have the answer. He just needed to fill in the gaps on how it could be that way to end up that way as an end result. But that's important too. And I kind of have sympathy for people, as much as I hate to say it. Like me and Dr. White, I don't know if we could be in the same room, because I disagree with, just for the reason that you said, of the questions that you wanted to ask. I would want to know too. But to me, it's a highly intelligent person, you know, with blinders on, and he's running down the road. And I always said, you know, if he looked at his own belief system the way he looked at Islam, I would take a much better liking to him. But as long as he's got the blinders on, I have a hard time with him. But maybe I got blinders on too and don't know it. On the other side, I think what I'm trying to say is tradition people see as important because it's safe. Tradition isn't only about being safe, but it's about cultural heritage and all the things that make community. So if you're going to come in and start pulling down the very posts that hold all these things up, you're doing just that. You're collapsing the whole community, you're collapsing the culture around it. So that's why these metaphorical and belief systems and the romanticized history that we might have of it, like we shouldn't you know, it's important to know, but we shouldn't be content with it. On the other hand, we shouldn't be so quick to tear it down, which is something that I have to hold back on sometimes when I'm with family who are evangelicals. And the church did them huge favors in their lives, where they would be criminals and things like that, had it not been for church community and people around them. So it worked for them. That's what I'm trying to say. So I don't want to go in and be like, oh, you know, and kick out all the posts and have them standing there with their, you know, mouths open wondering what to do. So I try to tone it down. I guess like Paul, I try to be, you know, talk religious and Bible verses and stuff when I'm around them, because I know culturally how important it is to them. But as far as believing it myself, you know, I would like to leave it open and view the different hypotheses. But when it's out of tradition and something foreign, they might see it as a form of intrusion or something that's mixing clean with unclean.
Well, I think it was well said, everything you just said. I mean, I think certainly want to respect people's right to obviously believe what they want to believe, and certainly back when I was a Muslim apologist, I really felt like I wanted to just sort of knock everyone's the posts underneath them and kind of leave them get, you know, with their mouths wide open. I don't feel like that really serves a purpose now. I've sort of mellowed out with my need to feel like I need to impress things upon people, but at the same time, and also I think it was great what you said, that, you know, we all have our own blinders on. It's almost impossible for us to totally escape the phenomena of confirmation bias and need to escape cognitive dissonance. But the best thing we can do for ourselves is just be aware of that. And that awareness, we're able to pick up on, are we engaging in that experience, that sort of cognitive pitfall, if you will, which comes so natural for us. You know, but having said that, yeah, I think that perhaps that is a reason why so many people, when faced with historical alternatives or just the historical record in general, or archaeology in general, they have a a problem, they run into this sort of, it's almost like a brick wall for them, because they don't, if they were to take the blinders off, it might be this overwhelming feeling of, well, now what? What's true? And then the real work of integrating this new material begins. Some people are really willing to do that. Some people aren't.
Yeah, one of the things that bothered me, especially when I get into religious conversations, and we've talked about this before, why I label myself an agnostic and not straight out atheist. It's mainly in retaliation to the atheist extremists being so forward, and they had a right to be when they were fighting evangelical fundamentalism, doing the same thing back. But if you're in those camps, there's no conversation between groups. With the label agnostic, I can jump around to the different sections of the field and talk to the different sheep and find out what they think, and without being rejected outright to where the conversation stops. One of the things that stops the conversation, I found, is if they find out you're a non-believer, is, oh, you don't know everything because you're not a believer, and the Holy Spirit isn't living within you to show you these types of truths. And I always was offended by that. Not that I know everything, but I think that some of the stuff that was gleaned by believers out of the literature is something that you pick up in public school when you're learning how to critique literature and what it's about, and interpret that in a way that you can use it. So a pastor friend of mine, we post questions to each other on Facebook, and we go through it. It's quite a bit of fun. He talked this, and what's amazing is Judaism had an answer to that, and which I always give to them when they tell me that, oh, you couldn't possibly understand because the Holy Spirit or whatnot, God hasn't made that manifest. And one of my favorite texts is out of Deuteronomy 30:11. I'm just going to read it because it's relevant here. Deuteronomy 30:11. Now what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven that you should have to ask, who will ascend to heaven and get it and proclaim it to us that we should obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea and get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may obey it. So, I mean, that tells me, I can read it. I feel the same way reading the Iliad when I sit down and I see the raging Achilles in conflict with Hector and the death of Patroclus. Very moving. It's almost as moving as, David's repentance after he was stricken with hardship from his affair with Bathsheba. Those types of things are all through literature, and it's beautiful. And to say that you can't glean spiritual truths from reading New Testament or Hebrew literature or Epic of Gilgamesh or whatnot, especially Gilgamesh when he knows that he's losing his friend Enkidu, and he goes on to try to find eternal life, and they're asking him, why are you going here and there? And he's telling them, my friend Enkidu is dying, and he has this big long speech, very beautiful, and that I apply those the same kind of way, and it's a shame that the conversation has to end with that, like, oh, you can't glean certain truths because you're not being fed by the Holy Spirit, or you're not part of our group. Now, I'm sure there are traditions that you can understand more if you are part of the group, because there are certain cultural associations and meanings that words take on that are much different. But I believe it's the community's job to tell other people that, rather than just say, well, this is where the conversation ends. You don't know. I got the answer. See ya.
Absolutely. Well, and I want to thank you for that, Wayman. And I just want to mention to the audience now that Path of Abraham has just entered the chat. And so originally I was just going to have our discussion go for the first hour, because typically what I've been doing is, the first hour will be the discussion, and then the last half hour of the show I just kind of take over solo and do some of the news. But I know that Path, you were delayed by transportation, and so instead of in other words, I want to change things up here, and what I'm going to do is just go ahead and we'll just continue the talk, because Path, you just came into the chat. So for those of you who are listening, the topic today is reconciling religious belief with the evidence from history and archaeology. And usually around the 5:30 p.m. mark, I would play a song to do like a 5-minute break. But I'm actually doing this broadcast live from the church that I'm staying in, and there's actually a concert happening in the hall right outside of the room that I stay in. And so while me talking in the mic isn't going to bother them, I don't want to play competing music. And so I think for this particular episode, since we're meeting on a Sunday, what I'd like to do is just continue our discussion past the this mark. So Path, I'd like to turn it over to you. And so what Wayman and I have been talking about is stuff like Robert Eisenman, and also we've been talking about people who seem to have a problem, certain believers who might have an issue with exploring alternative historical theories because it might threaten their religious narratives. So I would like to ask you, Path, as a practitioner of Judaism, how does the historical record jive with your perspective of your religious narrative? I mean, if, for example, you read something in the Hebrew Bible where the scripture is saying, talking about historical facts, if you will, or we might call them historical facts, and then we look at archaeology and there might be a discrepancy, how do you personally deal with that potential discrepancy, or is it a discrepancy at all for you?
Thank you for having me. I hope my mic's coming in clear. I don't have an external mic, so I'm using my laptop on at the moment. So it's actually a pretty interesting question. I would have to preface it by this question. The type of question itself requires me prefacing that this wouldn't have a standard answer. So like my answer wouldn't be reflective of my faith, and it really actually wouldn't be reflective necessarily of my my particular school of thought or my particular discipline specifically. So it's completely personal, because when it comes to these kinds of subject matters, things about what you might call maybe exegesis or theology, it's really kind of independent on the individual. It's not really something. It's something you're supposed to craft yourself. It's not supposed to be something you're supposed to necessarily follow. There are some schools of thoughts that do have like a certain chain of tradition about certain stuff, and like that comes with the ground. But but specifically these kinds of questions, there's no reflective tradition. And the last time we talked, actually, when we were talking about the Book of Job, I kind of highlighted that in specifically with the Book of Job, you have a section in the Talmud where it runs through a bunch of sages' opinions of where the Book of Job places, and some of them have it placing at the time of around the time of Adam, in the time of the garden, and they have other people placing the Book of Job in the Babylonian exile. So it's and then in between that you have people saying he's around Abraham's time, around Moses' time, around Isaiah's time. So within the Babylonian Talmud, just within the Book of Job, it's talking about this. You have all these different opinions about when the Book of Job is placed historically, and they're not minor differences. We're talking about thousands of years, possibly thousands of years in some cases. So when it would come to something, when you're talking about how does historical, archaeological evidence mash with maybe the narrative of the Bible as a whole, and for me it's a 24-book canon. It's not something we have a unified system to tackle because it's more or less irrelevant. It's something the individual tackles because it wouldn't. So this is kind of a short answer to your question. It's not. It wouldn't reflect any differently on our faith. It reflects differently on your personal theology, but it doesn't change your. It wouldn't in any way factor into. I couldn't see. At least I couldn't see a real scenario where there would be some kind of theological disruption, or not theological, religious and ritual disruption about a specific view of how you would interpret historical evidence with biblical narrative. So that's one factor that might be differing, especially from a Christian point of view, because I know Christians, especially I should say, because I know it's very different in the Eastern churches, but I know specifically in Western Protestantism in Europe and mainly in North America and South America, is that they put a big emphasis on the fact that the Bible itself has to be reflective of a certain narrative tradition, because they view the Hebrew text as having a specific goal to lead up to a certain endpoint, whereas Jews, we don't have a monolithic view of our Bible. Everybody interprets it differently. Everybody reads sections differently. The only thing I could think of historical or archaeological evidence that would affect our faith in a particular way would be a minor one. Would be if, let's say, the temple isn't where we currently believe it is in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem today, where the Dome over the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is currently, that kind of area. Let's say the temple ended up being closer, on the border with Lebanon. That would change some stuff. If we have historical evidence to back it up, I think that would override a lot of practices, which mainly just means changing direction of prayer and some other things about pilgrimages and stuff. But the most, I think, damaging thing that would actually affect the faith, the Jewish faith, the traditional Jewish faith, if there was historical evidence, would be if the documentary hypothesis was to be proven true with manuscript evidence of various complete Torahs void of certain sources, like void of P or void of J, either as standalone Torah scrolls, so like a complete J scroll, or you had different Torah scrolls that are missing certain editors and redactors that are traditionally seen in our current Torah. I think if we found manuscript evidence that shows a clear and actual evidence showing an evolution of a biblical text, I think that might affect something. But any other thing doesn't really, it only affects a person's belief. So I don't know if you have any specific examples you want to talk about, but I mean, I could say we have a principle. It's not really exactly related, but it's kind of like you kind of understand the idea. It's that if there's anything in Scripture that okay, I'm going to paraphrase. just make it sound easier. If there's anything in Scripture, the Bible, that contradicts the science of our age, we're supposed to read it as in a different way than we were reading it originally. So if we read it to be as scientifically true, and even, let's say, historically fact, we would then have a precedence to, if not an obligation, to reread it in a way that is not just not literal, but that doesn't contradict our current understanding of how science, or maybe even history. I think I don't think it'd be too much a stretch to add history to the context. How we would read the text, and that statement, that point of view, is pretty much predates Islam, or like just about. Maybe we're talking about 15 to 1400 years ago. I can think of, like, the first example I can think of when that idea is brought about. So what that really is telling you is it's not a reactionary theology. It's not like New Wave atheism came about and Jews were like, oh no, no, that part isn't literal. That part's some kind of metaphor, and oh no, we don't really believe that, or like that's archaic. It's not a tool of apologetics. It was created when there was no concept of biblical criticism, a real strong concept of atheism, or any critique of the biblical scriptures. And there was no outside face that were contending with our faith in reading our scriptures in the way that we were reading it. There was early Christianity, but they were taking a very different angle than how we would read it. And so we still have a tradition that dates from an earlier point in time that's pre-reactionary theology, that's stating if there's something in your text that contradicts your current understanding of how the world works, then you're supposed to read the text in a way that doesn't contradict it. So usually what that means is to not read it literally, let's say, or maybe you have to interpret it in a way that's more allegorical or symbolic, and at the same time you might still be able to view it as literal, but you still have to view it in a different way. But that's not to say that if modern secular evidence comes to contradict the scriptures, then we're saying modern secular evidence, or from even a different faith, is evil and has come to corrupt our scriptures. We're then saying, like, well, truth is truth, fact is fact. So that doesn't change anything about our scriptures, because it's not the point. It's not our scriptures aren't here to be a proof text for something. They're here as something a lot more personal, and as something a lot more has like a purpose and has a structure, but it's not here to like prove a point or like show evidence for the existence of God or something. So it's not tangible on my actual personal theology whether something in the Bible is to be allegorical or literal. Like, for instance, there's 4 major opinions about the Noah narrative. Well, okay, maybe 3. Let's say 3. There's a narrative that the flood was global, and that can fit in with what's written in the Bible. There's a narrative that the flood is local, and that could easily be fit in what's written literally in the Hebrew. Or there's also the stance that the flood never happened. It's completely allegorical. Now, all 3 stances are completely kosher, if you will, and valid within not just my school of thought, but just like in how our faith works in general. So when there's questions about doubts about, again, like historical or archaeological evidence coinciding with the Bible, it's really dependent on who you're talking to, how they view the Bible, and what's important to them. But overall, it doesn't really affect anything necessarily, because we're not supposed to view our Bible as kind of like a make or break thing. It has a specific goal and purpose, which is devoid of resting on evidence, whether it be historical or even necessarily prophetic, because we view our scripture as a whole to be more of a foundation for creating what you might call a functioning proper society. So I don't know if that's a little bit long-winded or answers your question, but that's at least my personal take. I don't know if you have anything more specific to ask.
Yeah, but I do appreciate your response. I guess one question that I have is, so you yourself gave an example, like if the flood is, let's say we interpret the flood as just being a sacred mythological story that has this allegorical substance, which that would be my personal opinion, both when it comes to studying things psychologically, but also theologically as well. So I guess my follow-up question is, does it, and I don't mean to totally put you on the spot, it's just, but would it be problematic from your school of thought within Judaism? Would it be an issue if, let's say, it was determined that, like, the Exodus never happened, historically speaking, or perhaps, as some historians say, one, the Exodus, there's no evidence for the Exodus, or two, that the Bible describes the kingdom of David and Solomon in this particular fashion, but archaeological evidence would suggest that the kingdoms of Solomon, for an example, the kingdom of Solomon was not as large, geographically speaking, as the Bible stipulates. So I guess my question is this really an issue, or rather, how much of the narrative, from your perspective within Judaism, from your school of thought's perspective, how much of the narrative can be interpreted allegorically before it becomes a major issue, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something I've thought about a lot and often, mainly because a lot of people bring it up, but I don't think it's really a question I can answer to any proper satisfaction, because it's not really so what's hard for people to take away without getting into a long conversation is that what's crucial and like the epitome of everything is that's required consensus, if you will, or like we strive to have consensus, and most of our faith is based off the consensus. When it comes to law and ritual law, that stuff is where it's like we don't. That's when people start interpreting differently. That's when issues start arising, and that's when things start falling apart. Not when it comes to abstract things like interpreting the Bible. So it's a little bit of a difficult question because it's just not really a reality. But let's say I would also have to answer specifically about, let's say, the Exodus and about the monarchies. Is our canon of scripture is divided into 3 sections, and it's not just related to grouping certain kinds of books together, but it's also related to the almost legitimacy of authorship and the style you're supposed to read specific texts. So our Bible's divided into 3 sections, and it's reflected in the name we call our Bible the Tanakh, which stands for Torah, which is our constitutional law, and it's a little more, well, it is the word of God, you can say. Then we have Nevi'im, that's the N in Tanakh, and that's for the prophets, and the historical, the counting of the historical era of the prophets. And then the third is the Ketuvim, that's the K in Tanakh. It's the sacred writings and various epistles, I think is the proper term, and like the Book of Esther. What's key about that is because that means that when you're talking about a specific text and specifically a narrative written in a specific book and in a specific area, we would read it very differently than another text. So a good example is what you give. So like it's a bigger issue to say that the Exodus never happened historically than to say that the kingdoms of David and Solomon, they weren't really world leaders, but they were more chieftains. We kind of assume that a lot of the historical elements, like the historical narrative, I should say, within the books of the prophetic section is usually romanticized. It's mythic history. It's kind of painted that way. We don't. It's not really something that's surprising. I mean, and again, I have to preface with saying, like, there's definitely people that would say this is literally exactly everything that happened historically in the Book of Kings and stuff, and other people that would say other opinions. But I would say, like, the vast majority consensus is like nobody reads the accounts of all of the conquest accounts and say some of the wars, and again with the kingdoms, and necessarily reads it in as reflective of somebody's recording history. I mean, if you just read some of the books, I think a lot of people don't understand that, and I think it's missed because a lot of people don't study. They study topics but don't study books. And if you read some of the books, especially the books that have the historical narratives, they're compilations, and they're later compilations. And a lot of people use this, like, especially in biblical criticism, against it. And I don't know, I guess it's maybe just a cultural difference, but Jews look at this criticism and like, well, it's in the text. The text is saying this was a redacted text. It was edited. And examples of this is when it says, well, if you want to know more about this king, go read it in the Annals of the Kings of Judah. Go read it in that section. So we already know it's giving you a redacted, edited version of history from other texts and probably from oral traditions. So it's condensed into a narrative. So to say that, well, there might be, let's say, there's the troops' size would never have been that large. It's like, okay, so it got embellished. Like, that doesn't change anything about the necessarily importance of the narrative, but again, it depends who you ask. But for me, like, something like that would just be like, well, it comes with the territory. Everything's going to be embellished. That's how we would record our history in that stylized form of writing. But again, that's my personal opinion. But I mean, something like the Exodus not happening. I'm very comfortable in saying that, and I'm saying I'm a lot more conservative than some of my teachers on this topic. But I would still say that I'm comfortable saying that the way that the Exodus account is written isn't necessarily how it happened historically. I know people that have much more liberal concept of this than I'm willing to take it. But yeah, again, I don't see it as being any way crucial or affecting anything of any real substance to my faith. Things about accuracy would be things like if the universe was eternal, or if it was cycles of universes and matter never came into existence. That would be a fundamental issue. A concept like yeah, I can't really think of something that archaeology would bring about in that context that would really change something to the fact that it would change the religion itself. It would change, like, individuals' personal stances. It might even push them out of the religion. Who knows? It might be like something that they couldn't handle. But I don't think it would change the mechanics of the faith necessarily drastically. But something like the universe not actually having a pinpoint static time of beginning in which there was an expanse that we call, like, the Big Bang. That would be something that would be more problematic than saying, like, the amount of people that the Torah says made the Exodus is impossible. It couldn't have been that much. Yeah, that's not really. It doesn't change anything necessarily, at least from my point of view. But that's just me. I'd probably have to think about it more, and maybe if I would have to think about maybe better examples, I would really test something. But I think the best example would be like undermining, like, literally kind of like the first few verses of the Torah.
Well, thank you for that response. I mean, it's really do appreciate your thoughts on it. Yeah, I mean, I think that I totally get where it would be like, how the narrative is perhaps, if the historical event did not occur, is that going to be really shattering? I mean, I know for me, the thing that really began the process for me to leave Islam was realizing that there wasn't really any historical evidence or archaeological evidence for the Exodus, because I was reading the text quite literally, and I was having a lot of issues with that reconciliation, and that was a huge part of what began to unravel not only my belief in Islam, but also began to open my eyes to alternative ways of reading Scripture, by looking at things more allegorically and not really having my faith totally resting on the foundation of historical accuracy. But I would also agree that, yeah, if suddenly it was proven, these huge important metaphysical concepts like the existence of God or what have you, having to do with reality itself, certainly to me that makes sense that would be more shattering than to say that perhaps narratives are romanticized or take on mythological qualities. Not mythological to be derogatory, but just perhaps not to be taken literally. So looking at the time, we have about 10 minutes left. Wayman, you've been quiet for the past I don't know how many minutes. So Wayman, do you have anything you'd like to say or anything you'd like to ask Path? Or Path, do you have anything you'd like to ask Wayman? I just want to open it up, get Wayman involved again.
Yeah, I think if I had a belief system back in the day, as Path does, I would still be in it. I would be perfectly free to agree with science, change things, and view the literature in the way that I needed it to help me. But it was static and it was not allowed, and I think that's what ends up being a problem. And how I wish to go back before biblical literalism, before evangelicals war with science back and forth, and before the statements of faith out of the late 1870s or whatever, on the fundamentals, which pushed people to even today say the types of things that the Bible has to be literal or you're not a real Christian. It's quite amazing to find out what that would have been like, and I think it would have been like the kind of belief system Path is following now. So, I think that's a good spot to be in. That's why I kind of have sympathies towards Judaism quite a bit.
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate that, and I also want to preface for people listening. It's a little bit. I wasn't brought up in my faith tradition, and it hasn't really been, in the grand scheme of things, that long that I've been observant. So it's not like I'm necessarily kind of being thankful of something that I didn't put any effort in. So I do appreciate that. And if I could just steal like the last few minutes and just ask Wayman kind of the same question, since you have more of a background in Protestant Christianity, how is like the same kind of ideas generally treated? I don't know if you already touched on that. I'm sure you did, but if you just give me like a quick summary, like is there, I guess maybe specifically, is there maybe even little pockets of schools of thoughts within American Protestantism that's maybe more accepting of this concepts while still being very much Bible, quote unquote, Bible-based Christians?
There are small pockets. Catholicism ends up handling it much better than Protestantism. However, in Protestantism, you end up getting a lot of flack for it. You're called a bunch of libs and a whole bunch of different things, not real Christians or unchristian, because it's seen as a huge intrusion, and it's seen as losing the war against some kind of identity. I think, back the Scopes monkey trial and when all that went, after that failed, they pulled the kids from public schools and home teaching and the whole thing. And I think a lot of times, like I was telling earlier before you came in, they do have the answers, and anything outside of that is an intrusion, and anything that is different needs to be explained. You know, that's why you get your Ray Comforts and your Slicks and people like that doing apologetics full time and making tons of money and headway with it, because they see science and those ideas as an infiltration into the fundamentals. And had they handled it as Judaism, I think the text would be so much better used, rather than battling constantly with reality.
But I'd also like to, just add on to that, if I may, because I mean, I totally agree with what Wayman, what you just said. I think I have to plug this since it's my current, theological foundation. But as a Swedenborgian, certainly a huge element of having what we would call rationalized theology, and so. My denomination, the General Convention of the New Jerusalem, or AKA the Swedenborgian Church of North America, there are many members within my denomination we're not very sure where we stand in the Christian spectrum, or whether we are sort of edging our way out of it, because we do take a more universalist, non-literal approach, and we definitely care about the reconciliation between reason, logic on one hand, and then spiritual growth on the other, and entertaining metaphysical concepts. So, I don't know the vast majority. I mean, I don't think there's been any polls that have been done. How many American or European Swedenborgians consider themselves like solid Protestant Christians, or how many of them view themselves as being post-theist or neo-Christians, or whatever you might want to call it. I know just within my small congregation that it's a mixed bag. There are some people who are very, very okay with saying, yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm a Swedenborgian. But then there are others who don't even consider themselves nominally Christian. So having said that, I think that for now, since I think in most organizations or groups of denominations, Swedenborgianism is considered to be a small Christian group, small Protestant Christian group, that certainly there is this huge emphasis on not taking the Bible literally. Swedenborg, and since I'm in this office or in this room, I can look over on this bookcase nearby, and I can see the 12-volume set of his Secrets of Heaven. And in that book, he did a verse-by-verse interpretation of all of Genesis and all of Exodus, and so he did not take those two books of the Bible literally. He actually interpreted them to be allegorical stories that have this deep theological meaning. And so for us, it's not really an issue. But the second I started talking to non-Swedenborgian Christians, particularly of the Protestant persuasion, they seem to be really invested in literalism and they seem to be very cautious of mystical or spiritual hermeneutics, even though that's a huge part of the Christian tradition, is not taking Scripture literally. And as you were saying, Path, like if something from history or something from what we know about reality seems to contradict the manifest letter of the text, to reinterpret it, some people are willing to do that, and some people aren't, as far as I can tell. So, yeah, I know that was also long-winded, and I apologize for that. But so we have a couple minutes left in the show now, and I guess at this point, I will let you both go. I want to thank both of you for coming on to the show. Wayman for coming on and joining me, and also Pat, thank you so much for. I know you were having transportation issues, but I want to thank you for coming on anyway and being a part of this conversation. So thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for having me, and sorry about just coming in for the last few minutes, but I had a great time, and I hope I get to do it again.
Yeah, very good discussion. Thanks. Look forward to the next one.
Absolutely. Have you both on again and very soon, so thank you. So for those of you who are watching the show currently, the next episode of Dreaming in Symbols, it will be next Saturday, which actually, no, I apologize. I'm glad I just checked my planner. It will not be next Saturday. Next Saturday, I'm going to be at a rock concert, and so I will not be doing the show next weekend. I will be engaging in some good old-fashioned heavy metal headbanging extravaganza. And so I will not be doing the show next weekend, but the next episode will be Saturday the 31st, which is Halloween. It's going to be a Halloween special with my good friend Tom, who, as I've mentioned in past episodes, Tom is an ex-Mormon and on his way to becoming an ordained Swedenborgian minister. So I'm going to be sitting down with him and talking about how scary it was to leave Mormonism, and I say scary not to be disparaging of his experience, but again, this is supposed to be a Halloween special, so we'll have some good candy. There might be some pumpkins in the background, but we're going to talk about his personal journey from Mormonism, LDS, to Swedenborgianism, and how that experience has shaped his life. And also I want to do a special shout out to Hazak, the Swedish theologian in training, who, from my understanding, has been watching the show live. I want to thank him for watching the show, and maybe we'll have him on the show at some point if I can rope him in to talk about his unique theological perspective. And thank you all for watching today, and hopefully this was an interesting show for all of you. So like I said, next Saturday, the 24th, there'll be no show. No show next weekend, but we will pick up with the podcast on the 31st, Halloween, with my friend Tom, discussing his journey from the Church of Latter-day Saints to Swedenborgianism. Thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.